A black veteran just stepped into Summit Ridge National Bank. He wasn't here to make trouble. He didn't raise his voice, didn't wave a flag, didn't shout about his past. He just wanted to pull a few $100s from an old account he hadn't touched in years. A simple errand. But what happened in the next 37 minutes would change everything because someone called him a fraud. Someone laughed at his name, and someone tried to erase the legacy of a man who once commanded entire battlefields. And just when the room thought they had him figured out, the glass doors swung open and a general in full uniform walked in with fire in his eyes. Stay with me. This is a story you won't forget. Before we begin, comment below and tell us where in the world you're watching from. And if this story moves you, don't forget to subscribe and share. It was just an ordinary Tuesday. Robert Keene Bobby, to those who knew him best, woke up that morning with a quiet determination. His coat, though old, was brushed clean. His hat, black with gold embroidery that read Korea, Vietnam veteran, sat on the table by the door, waiting like a loyal companion. He folded his discharge papers carefully, papers older than most people he would see that day. His VA card, creased from years of use, rested beside a brass challenge coin, its edges smooth from decades of fingers running along its surface during long nights of memory and silence. Bobby didn't think of himself as a hero. In fact, he didn't think of himself much at all. That was the way of men from his generation. You served, you came home, you carried on, and you didn't ask for more than your share. The bank was only 4 blocks away. The air was crisp with the hint of autumn. Bobby walked slowly, his cane tapping lightly against the sidewalk, not because he was weak, but because there were parts of his body that never fully healed from injuries no one documented. He didn't complain. He didn't even think of it as pain anymore, just a rhythm his bones had learned to hum. When he reached the bank's entrance, he adjusted his collar, straightened his coat, and opened the door with the same quiet strength he once used to lead platoons through jungle terrain. No one looked up. No one noticed inside. Summit Ridge National Bank buzzed with the soft noise of keyboards, murmured conversations, the occasional printer whir. A mother with 2 toddlers stood by the coffee station. A teenager scrolled through his phone. A sharply dressed man in a suit whispered into a Bluetooth headset. Bobby stepped into line behind an elderly woman counting checks. He waited, hands folded over the top of his cane. When it was his turn, he offered the teller a gentle smile. She looked young, 20-something, ponytail, nails perfectly done. Her name to morning, Miss, Bobby said, voice smooth but worn. I'd like to make a withdrawal, just a small one. He slid his ID across the counter. Name's Robert Keene. It's been a while since Tasha took the ID and typed. Then paused, her brow furrowed. Something didn't match. She muttered. One moment. Sir, I'll just get my manager. She gave him a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. Bobby waited. His hand brushed the outline of the coin in his coat pocket. It had been a long time since he'd taken it out. Then came Caden. If confidence were cologne, Caden wore it in clouds. His haircut was clean, his tie just a bit too short, his smirk polished like marble. He looked down at Bobby, then at the ID, then at the screen. You sure this account's yours, sir? He asked, dragging the sir out like a joke. These discharge forms, what? You print these off an antique typewriter. He chuckled. Tasha giggled nervously. Bobby said nothing. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out the coin. The brass glinted slightly under the overhead lights as he laid it gently on the counter between them. 7 stars? A Thunderbird. The kind of coin that meant you'd stood somewhere only a handful of others had. It didn't speak. It didn't need to. Caden didn't even look at it. Cute trinket. He said, anyone can buy one of those online. Then he turned to the security guard. We've got another wannabe vet. Escort him out. Please. The room shifted. A few people turned. A couple chuckled behind their phones. Someone whispered, oh boy, under their breath. The security guard hesitated. For just a second, but it was enough. Enough for Bobby to hear. Enough for the others to notice. Still, Bobby didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He picked up the coin with fingers that trembled, not from fear, not from weakness, but from time. He placed it back in his pocket, nodded once, and turned. Slowly, he walked to a bench near the front window and sat down. Upright, dignified, waiting. The laughter stopped, not out of respect, but because something had shifted. Something colder than guilt, a discomfort. Like when you realize you may have made a mistake, but it's too late to undo it. Tasha glanced at the manager. Caden rolled his eyes. Across the lobby, a woman in a navy blazer paused mid-step. Maya Rodriguez, early 30s, strong shoulders, quiet eyes. Former Air Force logistics. She froze when she saw the coin. She'd seen one like it before. Once. In a room full of officers where a JSOC colonel had laid it on the table and every single man in that room had stood without a word. She turned to the teller. "You just made a mistake," she said, her voice low but sharp. Caden blinked. "Excuse me?" She pointed to Bobby. "That man isn't a fake. That coin alone outranks every salary in this building." Caden snorted. "If he's so important, why's no one here with him?" Maya didn't answer. She stepped outside and pulled out her phone. But she wasn't the only one who'd noticed. In the back office, a quiet employee, white-haired, slow-moving, with the kind of calm that only comes from years no one remembers, had overheard the name. Robert Keene. He turned, walked to the far wall. There, mounted under a sheet of glass, was a plaque. Summit Ridge Command Base. A tribute, a forgotten piece of the past. He ran a finger over the names engraved in brass. And there it was. R.J. Keene. The man who had once commanded the land this bank now sat on. Without a word, the employee lifted the receiver and dialed a number only a few people still knew. When the line connected, he spoke just 6 words. "It's Bishop Coyne. Summit Ridge. He's here to. Then he hung up. Outside, Bobby sat still as stone. No phone, no fuss. Just watching the wind play with the flag across the street. Watching and waiting. Not for justice. Not for glory. Just because that's what men like him have always done. They wait. Even when no one believes them. Even when the world forgets. And inside that bank, in the quiet hum of tension and regret, no one realized yet that 30 minutes from now, a general would walk through those doors and change everything they thought they knew. But the air already knew. You could feel it in your teeth, in your chest. Something was coming, and it carried stars on its shoulders. Caden didn't notice the silence at first. He was too busy scrolling through something on his phone, still half laughing at his own joke. Behind him, Tasha tapped on her keyboard without really typing anything. The noise in the bank had thinned, not vanished, but changed, filtered now through a thick layer of unease. It was no longer just another Tuesday morning. Something about that old man sitting by the window, silent, unmoving, had shifted the current in the room. He hadn't said a word since being dismissed. No protest, no scene, just that calm, impossibly still posture. Like he had learned long ago that waiting sometimes said more than shouting ever could. Maya Rodriguez stood near the door now, her phone still in her hand. The call had already ended, but her fingers clenched around the device like it might still have something more to say. She glanced at Bobby. His eyes weren't on anyone, just the glass, just the sky beyond. Not once had he looked back at Caden, and that unsettled her more than if he had. She knew that silence, knew what it meant. Not submission, not defeat, but endurance. The kind of silence that came from men who'd stood through monsoons and firefights and watched friends fall without flinching. Caden finally noticed her staring. "You gonna stand there all day?" he said, voice too loud in the stillness. He tried to make it sound casual, but it cracked around the edges. Maya didn't respond. She didn't need to. The look in her eyes said enough. He turned away with a scoff, but something in him itched now. A warning, maybe, or guilt dressed up as annoyance. He looked back toward the bench and saw that Bobby hadn't moved an inch. Still there, still waiting, still radiating that quiet presence like a forgotten monument someone just tripped over. What's he even waiting for? Caden muttered to no one. He thinks this is going to go viral or something. Tasha didn't answer. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, then dropped to her lap. You think he's a real vet? She asked softly. Caden snorted. Who knows? Could be some old guy who watched too many war movies. People fake that stuff all the time. For attention, for money, for sympathy. Maya turned then, slowly, deliberately. You ever carry a body bag? Caden, she asked, her voice so steady it cut through the air. He blinked. Excuse me? Ever have to zip it shut while it's still warm? The color drained from his face, but he didn't answer. Didn't have to. She walked back to the middle of the lobby and stood still, waiting to now. The room had split in two, those who were still pretending this was normal, and those who already knew it wasn't. In the far corner, the quiet employee, Mr. Hall, the one with the silver hair and the soft shoes, stepped into the lobby. He wasn't holding anything. He didn't need to. His presence was enough. He looked at Bobby, then at the plaque on the wall, partially obscured by a potted plant that hadn't been watered properly in weeks. He reached over and moved the plant aside. Just a small gesture. But now the name was visible. Clear. R.J. Keene. A teenager by the ATM glanced up from his phone and noticed the movement. He read the plaque, looked at the man on the bench, back at the plaque, and then something changed in his posture. A shift. A silent acknowledgement. Still, Caden kept trying to pretend this was nothing. Okay, this is getting weird, he said. It's just a name. Probably coincidence. Mr. Hall didn't answer. He just walked back to his office, slow and steady, as if he were making room for something he already knew was coming. At that moment, the bank's automatic doors slid open with a familiar chime, but it wasn't who anyone expected. A woman with a baby stroller came in, looked around at the tense faces, and froze for a moment before awkwardly wheeling herself to the side. Even she could feel it. The tension didn't scream anymore. It breathed, slow and heavy, like something just under the surface waiting to rise. Back at the counter, Caden tried to shake the discomfort. He looked at Bobby again, then over at Maya. You called someone, he asked her, suspicious. Maya didn't answer. Instead, she asked him, do you know what that coin means? Caden rolled his eyes. You said it's military or something. Special ops. Whatever. No, she said, not just military or something. That's a bishop coin. You don't earn that. You're entrusted with it. There are fewer of those in circulation than 4-star generals. Caden opened his mouth, but no words came. That coin, Maya continued, isn't handed out. It's bestowed. It's recognition for operational contributions that can't be documented. You see what I'm saying? Caden blinked. No, he admitted. I don't. You're not supposed to. Maya said, that's the point. Just then, the phone on Tasha's desk rang. She answered instinctively. Her face paled. Yes. Yes. He's here, she said, glancing toward Bobby. Still seated? Yes, sir. Of course. She hung up and looked at Caden. Someone's on the way, she said. Caden frowned. Who? Tasha swallowed. He didn't say. Maya looked at her watch. She did the math in her head. The base wasn't far. If the right person was notified, if the person she hoped had been notified, then something irreversible was already in motion. She didn't know how much time was left, but she could feel it, like the barometric pressure before a storm. Something big was coming, the kind of presence that shifts the gravity in a room. Meanwhile, Bobby remained still. He hadn't looked at his watch. He hadn't asked what time it was. He hadn't moved at all, save for the occasional blink. That coin was back in his coat pocket, and his hands rested on his cane. People had started to notice his posture, the way he sat straight without seeming stiff, the way he didn't slump or fidget like most old men might. There was discipline in his stillness, echoes of something deeper. The man near the coffee station dumped his unfinished drink in the trash and walked out without making his deposit. The air was too heavy now. Even the background music, normally some light jazz station, had been turned off without anyone realizing when Tasha tried to focus on her screen, but her eyes kept drifting back to the bench. She didn't understand the full weight of what was happening, but she felt the shape of it pressing down. Across the room, the teenager who had been watching glanced up again. This time, he took his earbuds out. No one had asked him to. He just felt like maybe he should be listening. Another customer entered, then another. Each one paused, sensing the tension, then navigating around it like furniture in a room that had been rearranged without warning. And still, Caden paced. I swear, he muttered to himself, if this turns into some TikTok pity stunt. No one responded. Not even Tasha this time. Caden looked around and realized he was the only one still pretending this wasn't real. And then he heard it. The sound of boots. Not loud. Not rushed, but deliberate, measured. Approaching, each step echoing with the certainty of command. And for the first time all morning, Caden didn't have anything clever to say. The boots struck the tile with precision, not force. There was no need for force. The weight of authority doesn't stomp, it simply arrives, and the room bends around it. The doors hadn't slammed, no alarms had sounded, yet the very molecules in the air seemed to rearrange themselves the moment Major General Everett Kane entered Summit Ridge National Bank. He was not a man who required introduction. The razor-sharp lines of his full dress uniform, the silence in his stride, the unmoving eyes scanning the room with surgical clarity, all of it sent a message that arrived long before his voice did. No one spoke. Not Caden, not Tasha, not the clients still pretending to be busy with forms or coffee or their phones. They were all watching now. Every eye followed the general as he passed through the lobby like a slow-moving storm front. At his side walked a younger man, mid-30s, carrying a briefcase with the kind of grip reserved for classified intel. His face was unreadable. His eyes never left the general's back. Kane walked past the teller line without glancing once at the counter, without even acknowledging the humans occupying it. His boots made no unnecessary sound, yet every step landed with the precision of ritual. When he stopped, it wasn't because he reached a marker, it was because he had arrived at the presence that anchored the entire room. Colonel Robert Keene, still seated by the window, still unmoved, still holding the silence like a soldier would hold a position until ordered otherwise. The general stopped directly in front of him. The pause lasted only a breath, but in that breath, the bank held itself still. Even the air conditioning seemed to hush. And then, without flourish, without word, General Kane snapped to attention and offered a salute so clean, so deliberate, it sounded like steel striking marble. The crack of palm to temple echoed through the lobby like a verdict. Bobby looked up slowly. His eyes, steady despite their age, met Kane's. For just a moment, there was no bank, no misunderstanding, no shame, just two soldiers connected by a thread woven through battlefields and oaths the rest of the world would never hear about. Bobby returned the salute. Not fast, not slow, just right, like muscle memory, like respect deserved and given. Kane turned then, his posture straight and lethal, his gaze slicing through the room. "Who here?" he said, voice low but edged with command. Accused Colonel Robert Keene of fraud. His words weren't raised, yet they traveled farther than any shout could have. He didn't need volume, he had gravity. No one answered. No one moved. It was as if sound had abandoned the building. Ashamed to linger in a room where such a question had to be asked at all, Caden's face drained of color. He opened his mouth once, then again, but nothing came out. Kane took a step forward. "Colonel Keene," he continued, emphasizing the rank, "is not only a decorated war veteran, he is the strategic architect behind the very infrastructure this bank rests upon. He served in 6 theaters, 2 full-scale wars, and 14 operations that will never be acknowledged by your history books." His voice did not rise, but the intensity curled around every syllable like wire. "And yet you questioned his identity based on the age of his paperwork." Kane's aide stepped forward and set the briefcase on the counter. He opened it slowly, precisely like unlocking a vault. Inside, neatly arranged, was a thick folder stamped with a red classified seal, a commemorative coin encased in velvet, and a scan of the brass dedication plaque that still hung in the lobby, now fully visible, thanks to Mr. Hall's earlier quiet intervention. Kane reached in and removed the coin, holding it up between two fingers for the room to see. This, he said, turning slowly so no one could pretend not to see, is not something you can buy online. This is a bishop coin, awarded for service so vital, so classified, that no metal could suffice. There are 5 in circulation. Colonel Keene holds one. He placed it gently on the counter and turned back to Bobby. "Sir," he said, voice softening, "we didn't know you were in town sooner. If we had, this wouldn't have happened." Bobby nodded once, slow, thoughtful. "Didn't come to be found," he said quietly. "Just needed to pull enough to help my grandson with school. Thought this old account might still have something left." Kane turned back to the counter. "Then let's make that happen." Caden, still frozen, stumbled backward as the general approached. The manager's earlier smirk was gone, replaced with a pale sweat that made his skin look almost translucent. I I didn't know," he stammered. "His papers look fake. And of course they're old." Kane cut in. "He's earned his age. While you were learning how to send emojis, he was writing recon doctrines still used by 5 allied nations." Caden's mouth opened again but found nothing useful to say. The teller, Tasha, stepped forward with trembling hands and began processing the withdrawal. Every movement was careful now, reverent even, as if the very act of handling Bobby's account required penance. While the transaction was processed, Kane simply stood beside Bobby. No speeches, no orders, just presence, unmoving, immovable. A man who understood that sometimes. Standing beside someone is the highest form of honor. The silence in the lobby had transformed. It was no longer awkward, it was sacred. Even the children in the stroller near the door were quiet, as if the gravity in the room had reached them too. When the receipt printed, Tasha offered it with both hands, whispering, "I'm so sorry, sir." Without lifting her gaze, Bobby didn't respond, not out of bitterness, but because apology wasn't something he needed. He took the slip, folded it once, tucked it into his coat like it was just another document in a life filled with important papers, and began to rise. But before he could stand fully, Kane placed a hand gently on his shoulder. "Colonel," he said, "you have 5 minutes." Bobby raised an eyebrow. For what? Kane gestured toward the room. "For the honor you never asked for, and without command, without signal." Every military veteran in the building stood. It began with the teenage reservist near the ATM, then the older Navy corpsman seated with a deposit slip, then Maya, then Mr. Hall. Even the civilians followed, rising not out of obligation, but instinct, because something in the air told them this is how you honor a man like that. Bobby stood straighter now. He didn't smile, didn't cry. He simply returned each salute offered to him with precision, with dignity, with the quiet gravity of a man who never sought recognition, but carried the weight of it anyway. Kane reached into his coat one last time and pulled out a small velvet box. He handed it to Bobby without explanation. Bobby opened it slowly. Inside, a metal polished, pristine, engraved only with a name and 3 words, "Service Beyond Record." Bobby stared at it, not with surprise, but with a long, silent acknowledgement, like something unfinished had just been brought home. He looked up at Kane. "I didn't come here to be remembered," he said softly. "I came to keep a promise." Kane nodded. "And in doing so, you reminded us all what service really means." Then Bobby turned, stepped into the sunlight, and left. No cameras followed. No headlines came. But the people inside that bank stood a little straighter, spoke a little softer. And when the plaque by the entrance was updated later that week with a new line beneath the dedication, it didn't mention the incident. It didn't name the general, it didn't shout. It simply read Robert J.M. Keene, Colonel, U.S. Army honor in silence, and somehow that said everything. Outside the glass doors of Summit Ridge National Bank, the wind had picked up. It carried the scent of dry leaves and distant pine, rustling through the small flags planted in the flower bed by the entrance, flags that few had noticed before. But now everything felt sharper, more visible. The sun cut through the haze with fresh clarity, glinting off passing windshields, flashing briefly on the brass plaque by the door, the same plaque that now bore a new inscription etched in silence and respect. Inside, the air hung heavy, not with tension anymore, but something weightier recognition, the kind that lingers long after the uniform leaves the room. Though Colonel Robert Keene had walked out nearly 15 minutes earlier, no one had truly resumed normalcy. Not really. Conversations, where they resumed, had become subdued, reflective. Phones were set down. Laughter had vanished. The espresso machine near the self-serve coffee bar had stopped whirring, its blinking light ignored. It was as if the entire institution, every brick, every polished tile, was recalibrating itself to the weight of what had just happened. Caden stood at the corner of the lobby now, no longer behind the counter but beside it, posture slouched in a way that suggested he wanted to disappear entirely. He had tried, in the briefest moments after the general departed, to reclaim some semblance of dignity, to mutter something to the effect of, "I was just doing my job." But even the words had fallen flat, echoing with a hollowness that only deepened the silence around him. Nobody responded. Not Tasha, not Mr. Hall, not Maya, especially not Maya. She had moved closer to the bench where Bobby had sat just moments earlier, her arms folded across her chest, face unreadable. She hadn't spoken since the general's final salute. Her eyes now traced the floor like she was trying to make sense of the past hour in footprints. In the back office, the silent phone suddenly rang again. This time, Mr. Hall answered, his tone calm but firmer than before. "Yes," he said, "the situation has been handled. The colonel has departed." A pause. "No, I don't think it will happen again." Another pause. "Yes, sir. Thank you." He hung up, placed the receiver back in its cradle with a soft click, and then did something no one expected. He walked back out into the lobby carrying an old binder. The binder was large, dusty, and thick with laminated pages. It looked like something that hadn't been touched in years. He placed it carefully on the main counter and opened it, flipping to a tab marked Founding Documents. Beneath a transparent sleeve lay a photo, slightly yellowed with time, showing a group of uniformed men standing in front of a steel frame and concrete pylons, the earliest phase of the Summit Ridge facility. In the center of the photo was a younger man with sharp eyes and a jaw set in determination. His name tag read R.J. Keene. The resemblance was unmistakable. Tasha leaned over, covering her mouth with one hand. "That's him," she whispered. "That's really him." Mr. Hall didn't answer. He simply nodded once, slow and heavy, before turning the page to a copy of the original base deed signed, among others, by Colonel Keene himself. For decades, the land had been transferred through federal, then state, and finally private ownership. But the roots of this place were military. It had never stopped being built on service. Caden finally moved. His voice, cracked and dry, barely rose above a whisper. "How did we not know?" Maya turned to him. Her voice was cool, but there was no malice. Because people like him don't talk about what they've done. They don't wear it on their chest like a brand. They carry it in their silence. Caden said nothing. His hands fidgeted at his sides. "I didn't mean to he began, but even the sentence knew it had no destination." Near the front window, the teenager who'd been watching the whole time walked quietly up to the binder. His hoodie sleeves were too long, and he had the awkward stillness of someone trying to be respectful in a room where he suddenly understood he was out of his depth. He looked at the photo for a long moment. Then he pulled something from his backpack, a crumpled notebook, and carefully slid a single loose sheet into one of the back sleeves of the binder. No one said anything. Maya walked over after he stepped away and looked at what he had added. It was a sketch, pencil on lined paper, A rough but recognizable drawing of the colonel sitting on the bench, one hand resting on his cane, the other on the coin placed in front of him. In the background, the general stood tall in salute. Beneath the drawing, the boy had written in block letters, "We almost missed history." Mr. Hall closed the binder carefully and slid it under the counter again. It would stay there, but now people would know it existed. A new reverence began to seep into the ordinary tasks. A customer approached the teller window and greeted Tasha not with a transaction, but with, "He was really someone." Huh. Tasha only nodded. "He still is," she said. Outside, the wind continued to hum along the sidewalk. Colonel Keene had walked 3 blocks without pause, his pace steady, his shoulders upright. He hadn't looked back. However, stopped briefly outside a small bus stop where a woman with 2 young children sat. One of the kids had stared at his hat. Eyes wide, Bobby had crouched slightly, smiled, and handed the boy something small. The boy looked down to see an old dog tag worn, scratched, but engraved with quiet legacy. "Hold on to that," Bobby had said. It belonged to someone who once believed in doing the right thing, even when no one's watching. Back at the bank, Caden had retreated into his office. The door wasn't closed, but no one followed him. Through the window, he could be seen pacing, then sitting, then pacing again. At one point, he reached for his phone, scrolled through a few apps, then stopped, locked the screen, and set it face down on the desk. A few minutes later, he stepped back out. No announcement, no apology. He just stood in the center of the room and cleared his throat. "I was wrong," he said, voice uneven. "I didn't know who he was. I didn't even try to know. I saw a man with old papers and made a decision I had no right to make." He paused, looked at the faces around him. "I can't undo what happened, but I can make sure this place never forgets it. It wasn't a performance. It wasn't enough either, but it was a start." Later that week, 2 things quietly happened at Summit Ridge. First, the binder Mr. Hall had retrieved was placed in a new glass case near the entrance. Its cover replaced with a printed plaque, "Foundations of Honor." Inside was the photo, the deed, and the sketch drawn by the boy. The dog tag, returned by mail with a note signed only E, was placed beside them. Second, a new employee training manual was updated. Page 3 now began with a quote, "Never assume silence is weakness. Sometimes it's discipline." As for Bobby, he returned home that evening without ceremony. He brewed a cup of black coffee, fed the stray cat that lingered by his back porch, and folded the withdrawal receipt into the same drawer that held his other records. The velvet box sat unopened beside it. When his grandson called later to thank him, Bobby simply said, "Just keep your head down and do the work. That's enough." But somewhere deep down, though he'd never admit it, he felt something settle. A weight lifted. Not pride. Not vindication. Just peace, the kind earned not in the spotlight, but in the quiet corners of history, where men like him had always belonged. 3 days after Colonel Robert Keene walked out of Summit Ridge National Bank, the lobby still bore the weight of what had happened. Not in any obvious way, no banners had been raised, no speeches made, but in the tiny, almost imperceptible shifts in how people moved, how they spoke, and how they looked at one another. The staff still went about their duties, but there was a softness now, a quiet awareness that hadn't existed before. Customers who had witnessed the incident returned with a new tone in their voice. Some asked about the man who sat by the window. Others didn't ask at all, but lingered a little longer near the new glass case near the entrance, the one labeled "Foundations of Honor." Inside it, the black and white photo of the original base build stood beside the dog tag, the sketch, and the aged copy of the founding deed. Most never said a word when they looked at it. They just paused and read and remembered. But outside the bank, something else had begun to move. Not in headlines or viral hashtags, though. A few video clips from phones had made their way onto local veteran forums and small news outlets, but in the quiet corridors of power, where names like Keene still held weight, even if most civilians had long forgotten. At Fort Brixton, a regional military installation 20 miles away, General Everett Kane stood behind a long oak conference table in a restricted operations room. His expression, as always, was unreadable, his words sparse. But the room filled with younger officers, analysts, and a few stone-faced veterans hung on each one. He didn't want a spectacle, Kane said, his eyes scanning the faces. He didn't want medals or apologies. He only wanted to keep a promise. And we nearly let the world forget him. No one replied. That, Kane continued, will not happen again. He motioned to his aide, who stepped forward and placed a file on the table. The folder was thinner than expected, but heavy with implication. We've reopened the Keene archive, the aide said, cleared for limited declassification, non-operational segments only, but it's enough to correct the record. One of the officers, a woman in her 40s with an intelligence background, raised an eyebrow. After all these years, why now? Kane's response was simple, because the silence around him almost turned to erasure, and silence is only honorable when it's chosen, not enforced. The folder was passed down the table. Inside were old operation maps, commendation transcripts, internal memos written in coded military shorthand, and photos that never made it into public records. They told the story not just of a soldier, but of a man who had shaped doctrine, brokered peace in shadows, and saved lives in ways that would never be televised. His fingerprints were on the foundations of more than one nation's security. And yet, for all that, he had walked into a bank alone, carrying a coin instead of a resume. The room sat in silence after the last page was turned. Then Kane said quietly, "Draft the citation. I'll sign it personally, Baum. We owe him that." Back in the suburbs, Bobby's days returned to a rhythm that could only be described as humble. He rose early, fed the neighborhood cat, now named Whiskey. He tended the garden with slow, practiced hands, and drank his coffee without cream. Occasionally, he'd receive a letter in the mail. One from the young man who'd drawn the sketch. Another from a former subordinate who'd seen the story on a vet form and recognized the Thunderbird on the bishop coin. Bobby read each one without ceremony. He answered few, but each envelope was folded and tucked into an old box beneath his bed, one labeled only Echoes. One afternoon, as he sat on his porch with a worn paperback resting on his lap, a car pulled into the driveway. Not military, just a modest civilian sedan, navy blue with plates from out of state. A woman stepped out, mid-30s, olive skin, hair pulled into a loose bun. She wore no uniform, no badge, just a messenger bag and a look in her eyes that Bobby recognized instantly, the look of someone who'd spent time in rooms filled with maps and silence. "Colonel Keene?" she asked. Bobby nodded once. "That's me." She stepped forward and offered a folder, not official looking, just manila, creased at the edges. "I'm not here from the government," she said, "not officially. I'm here on behalf of those who served under your doctrine. My name's Lila Chen. My father was recon. He used to speak your name like it was a compass or bearing." Bobby didn't reach for the folder. "Not yet. And what's in there?" he asked. "History," she said. "And maybe a correction." At last, he accepted the folder, but didn't open it. He gestured to the second chair on the porch. "You drove all this way. Might as well sit." She did. They sat in silence for several minutes, the kind of silence that doesn't ask to be broken. Eventually, Bobby spoke. "Funny thing about corrections," he said, "they tend to come after the people who needed them most are already gone." Lila didn't argue. "That's why I brought it now." He opened the folder. Inside were copies old orders reclassified, field memos from foreign soil, and photographs he hadn't seen in decades. Faces of men long gone, some smiling, some not. And at the very bottom, a printed copy of an internal memo from the Department of Defense, marked with a recent date. The document was a recommendation, a formal one, to posthumously elevate Colonel Robert J. Keene's military citation to include joint strategic recognition for operations contributing to national and allied stability from 1971 through 1985. A note was attached in handwriting, still alive, still watching. No posthumous, anything. E.C. Bobby chuckled. That man doesn't change. No, Lila said, but he makes sure others do. They talked for a while after that, about legacy, about loss, about the dangerous quiet between wars and headlines. Before she left, she offered him a card. Not military, not official, just a note written on thick paper. On the front, thank you for showing us what silence can mean. On the back, next week, Fort Brixton, no speeches, just honor. Your seat will be waiting. He didn't promise he'd go. But when she pulled away, he didn't throw the card out either. That night, Bobby stood alone in his kitchen, the lights low, the wind whispering through the screen door. He placed the card beside his medal. He didn't need recognition. He never had. But for the first time in a long while, he wondered if maybe, just maybe, the story wasn't over yet. Maybe the silence had one more page left to turn. The morning of the Fort Brixton ceremony arrived with little fanfare. The sky held a heavy gray, not yet rain but full of its intention, and the wind carried the low rustle of coming weather. Bobby Keene stood in front of the mirror in his small bedroom, the same one he'd had since his wife passed away almost 15 years prior. He didn't look at himself so much as threw himself past the reflection and into something whipper, something older. He was dressed in a simple charcoal suit, one of the few pieces of formal clothing he owned that wasn't military issue. A muted tie, shoes shined just enough to whisper effort, not vanity. The bishop coin sat in the breast pocket of his jacket, not visible, not flashy, just close, close to the heart. His hand lingered on the doorknob for a moment before he turned it. Outside, the air smelled of wet bark and clean earth. His neighbor, Mr. Denton, waved from across the street, a subtle nod of understanding passing between them. No questions, just acknowledgement. The kind men of a certain generation had mastered a language made of looks, silence, and time. The black government SUV arrived exactly at 0700 hours. No sirens, no flags, just sleek efficiency. A young officer stepped out, crisply dressed, barely 30, face serious but not cold. Colonel Keene, he asked. Bobby nodded. The officer opened the rear passenger door and waited, standing tall as if the air itself required a straight spine. Bobby didn't need help getting in, though the offer was there in the subtle shift of the officer's arm. Inside, the vehicle was quiet. No chatter, no music, just the low hum of the road beneath them and the occasional chirp from the radio that the driver never answered. The route to Fort Brixton was familiar, though Bobby hadn't taken it in decades. Time had changed the scenery, new roads, new buildings. Even the trees seemed different somehow, but certain things remained. The arch at the entrance, the sharp angles of the old barracks, the solemn slope of the ceremonial field. And as they pulled in, Bobby noticed something that caught him off guard. Not the security, not the flags, but the people. Lining the interior of the approach road were soldiers, young, old, uniformed, and civilian. Some stood at attention, others simply watched. No one cheered, no one clapped, but they were there, lining the path like sentinels of silence. At the main building, Kane waited, not in a grand hall or stage platform, but under the portico near the entrance, hands clasped behind his back, his expression unreadable as always. When the car stopped, he stepped forward and opened the door himself. "Colonel," he said simply. Bobby stepped out, nodded once. "General." They didn't shake hands. They didn't need to. Instead, Kane motioned toward the entrance, and they walked side by side into the building, the aide with the briefcase following silently behind them. Inside, the room was a modest auditorium, no grandeur, no television crews, just rows of seats filled with uniforms from all branches, along with a scattering of civilians. Maya Rodriguez was there, seated in the second row, hands folded tightly in her lap. Tasha, the young teller from the bank, sat beside her, visibly nervous but upright. "Mr. Hall from the bank had come too, dressed in his old blazer with the Summit Ridge lapel pin polished to a shine. The young artist, hoodie neatly ironed, was seated near the end of the row with a fresh sketch pad resting on his knee. Lila Chen was there as well, standing at the side with a small camera not to broadcast, but to preserve. Bobby walked to the front slowly, his steps measured not from weakness, but from intention. A single chair awaited him on the stage, and beside it, a podium bearing the Fort Brixton insignia. Kane remained standing. "There won't be a speech," Kane said, addressing the room, "because the man we're here for has never needed one." He paused, scanning the faces. "What you will hear today is not a presentation. It is a correction, a line added to a history book that forgot to finish a sentence. We are here not to elevate, but to restore." He turned slightly toward Bobby. "Colonel Keene's service has remained, until recently, shrouded in classification. His operations were never discussed in the public sphere. His victories were never televised. His name was known only in quiet rooms, written on documents never meant for daylight." Kane reached for a folder handed to him by his aide. "Today, we lift a fraction of that veil not for him, but for those who need to know what service without recognition looks like." He began to read. Not flowery prose, not political platitudes, but citations, specific dates, locations, impacts, strategic protocols that Bobby had drafted in war zones that would one day become peacetime cities, operations where a single decision prevented an escalation that could have cost thousands of lives. Letters from foreign commanders who wrote in coded reverence, thanking the silent hand that guided our survival. Each word was a stitch in the tapestry that had been buried for too long. As Kane finished, he stepped aside, and the aide approached with a velvet-covered box. Inside, a medal unlike any standard issue. It bore no ribbon, only metal, dense, untarnished, engraved with the Thunderbird, 7 stars, and a single phrase beneath the name Silence, honor, legacy. Kane turned toward Bobby. "This is not an award," he said. "It's a record." Bobby didn't move for a moment. Then he stood, slowly, with the deliberateness of someone for whom every motion must carry weight. He accepted the medal, looked at it for a long second, then closed the box and held it at his side. He didn't smile. He didn't cry. But in the stillness of his stance, something changed in the room. Even those who had never met him felt it, that rare and unmistakable shift when a story once hidden finally touches daylight. Bobby turned to the audience. He didn't walk to the podium. He didn't need amplification. When he spoke, his voice was low but carried. "I didn't come here to collect anything," he said. "I came here because silence only holds meaning when someone, somewhere, remembers what it cost." He looked around, meeting eyes but not holding them long. "We were never meant to be known. That was the agreement. But sometimes the world forgets why it sleeps peacefully, and sometimes it needs reminding." He placed the box on the podium, not as an offering, but as a placeholder, something real to mark what words never could. Then, with no farewell, no lingering gaze, he stepped down and walked slowly back toward the aisle. As he passed the audience, they began to rise, one by one. No command had been given. No sign had been raised. But every soldier, every civilian, every officer, and every witness stood. A few saluted. Most didn't. They simply stood because something in them knew this was not a moment for applause. It was a moment for memory. Outside, the rain had started. Not a storm, just a soft, steady drizzle. Bobby exited the building alone, hat in hand, the wind tugging gently at the hem of his coat. The SUV waited but didn't rush. He paused by the flagpole, looked up once, and nodded as if to an old friend. Then he got in and rode away, not as a man celebrated, but as one returned. Not every story needs a parade. Some just need to be told. The return drive from Fort Brixton was quiet, but not in the way silence had felt before. This time it carried no burden. No shame. It was the quiet of something complete, of a circle, long left open, finally closed. Colonel Robert Keene sat in the back seat of the government SUV, hands folded loosely in his lap, eyes resting on the blurred trees passing by beyond the window. He didn't speak. Neither did the officer driving. There were no formalities, no reports to file, no logistics to coordinate. This wasn't a mission. It was something far older, far simpler. A man going home. The medal had not come with him. He'd left it intentionally in the glass display case in Fort Brixton's Hall of Legacy beneath a small plaque that bore only his name and 3 words, "He kept his word." The case wasn't labeled with rank or decorated with ribbons. It wasn't a monument, just a marker. A quiet reminder that not all heroes live in chapters taught to school children. As the car turned into his neighborhood, Bobby noticed subtle changes. The hedge by his mailbox had been trimmed. The flagpole in his yard, once leaning slightly from age, now stood perfectly straight, newly anchored in concrete. A fresh American flag waved crisply in the breeze. When the car came to a stop, the officer stepped out and walked around to open the door. But Bobby was already moving. He gave the young man a nod, not as a superior, not even as a soldier, but as one human recognizing another. "Thank you for the ride," he said. The officer smiled. "Thank you for everything, sir." Then he saluted, not because protocol demanded it, but because something inside him knew it was right. As the SUV pulled away, Bobby turned toward his house, but paused. Sitting on the porch was a small envelope, sealed with a simple wax stamp bearing the shape of a 7-pointed star. He bent down, picked it up, and turned it over in his hand. No name, no address, just the symbol. Inside, a single piece of paper, a handwritten note. The handwriting was unfamiliar but careful. "Sir, thank you for standing so the rest of us could sit in peace. If you ever find yourself near Hillview High School, I'd be honored to have you speak to our civic students. No cameras, no stage, just a room of kids who need to know what integrity looks like." It was signed simply Maya. Bobby smiled faintly. Not because he wanted to be a speaker, he didn't, but because the invitation itself meant something had shifted, not just in the bank that day, but in the way people remembered. He pocketed the note and stepped inside. Days passed, then a week. Life returned to its quiet hum. The garden grew steadily under his care. The local grocer, who'd never spoken more than a few words, suddenly called Bobby by name and offered him the store's last bunch of fresh greens one morning. The teenager with the sketch pad mailed him a copy of the drawing, professionally printed and framed, with a short note on the back. "You were the reason I started drawing again." And then there was the coin, the bishop coin, still resting in the pocket of his suit jacket, undisturbed. It had traveled through wars, survived oceans, sat through decades of dust and indifference, and now, finally, it had seen acknowledgement. Not validation, not praise, just recognition that it had never been counterfeit, never been decoration. It had always been what it was: earned, trusted, real. One Thursday afternoon, Bobby received another envelope, this time from the Department of Veterans Affairs. He assumed it was routine, an update about benefits, maybe a notification of some new program, but inside was a certificate, simple, no seal, no ceremony. It read, "This letter serves as formal reinstatement of Colonel Robert J. Keene's advisory clearance. Status active honorary, clearance level legacy access." It wasn't a job, it wasn't an assignment. It was a door being reopened that had quietly been closed without him ever being told. The past, it seemed, was not finished speaking. Later that day, Bobby stood at the edge of the town's public square. A new bench had been installed beneath a large oak tree, not far from the veteran memorial wall. The bench bore no names, no ranks, just a small brass inscription that read, "Reserved for those who kept watch while others slept." He sat down slowly, cane resting against the armrest, and listened. Children played in the distance. Cars passed. The world moved forward. But around him, time felt different, as if somewhere beneath the grass, beneath the pavement, beneath the routine, The echo of footsteps and forgotten orders still pulsed in the roots of the place. A man in his 20s approached. Hesitant, he wore a baseball cap backwards and carried a small notepad. "Excuse me, sir," he said. "Are you, were you at Summit Ridge a couple weeks ago?" Bobby looked at him and nodded. "Yes." The young man's face lit up with nervous energy. I was there. I saw it. I've never seen anything like that. I've read about wars and commanders in books, but that was different. That was—" He paused, unsure how to finish. Bobby waited. "That was real," the man said finally. "It made me want to join. Not to fight, but to serve. I just, I wanted to say thank you." Bobby nodded again. "Then serve well," he said. "That's all any of us ever tried to do." The man lingered a moment longer, then walked away, his shoulders squared just slightly more than before. That evening, as the sun dipped low and cast long gold shadows across the streets, Bobby stood on his porch and looked out over his neighborhood. He could hear the murmur of a television in a nearby house, the clatter of a dinner plate being washed, the laughter of children chasing each other down the sidewalk. And in all of it, he felt a strange peace, not because anything grand had changed, not because he had become famous or praised, but because something small, something essential, had been restored. The truth had been seen, the silence had spoken, and people had listened. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the sketch the boy had sent him. He held it up to the light, looked at the lines, the shading, the depth of the salute. Then he turned it over and wrote something on the back with a pen he kept by the door. He folded it neatly and placed it in an envelope addressed to Fort Brixton. No return name, no need. Just a message that read, "The next time a man walks into a room with silence in his step and age in his papers, listen. You might be sitting in a building he once built with more than bricks." And with that, Colonel Robert Keene turned off the porch light, stepped back inside, and let the night return to its gentle, steady rhythm. The following month unfolded not with fireworks or flags, but with the kind of quiet that stays in the corners of a room long after the people have gone. Colonel Robert Keene's days became a ritual of slow mornings, black coffee, tending to the garden with gentle hands, and watching the world pass by from the same creaky porch where he'd stood for years. But something had changed, though not outwardly obvious. The very air seemed different around him. Neighbors he'd known for decades suddenly greeted him with something more than politeness. The mailman, who used to drop letters in silence, now took a few extra moments to speak, never about the medal or the incident at the bank, but about life, family, the small worries of everyday people. It was as though the world, having glimpsed the depth of the silence Bobby carried, now chose to fill it with honest words. One morning, a letter arrived, not official, not marked with insignia or stamps of state, but personal. The handwriting was blocky and a little uneven, like someone writing carefully. Not out of lack of education, but out of determination to say things right. Bobby unfolded it slowly and began to read. "Colonel Keene, I don't know if you remember me. I was the kid at the bank, the one who laughed when they told you to leave. I didn't know anything. I didn't even know what I was laughing at. But when the general walked in, when everyone stood up, I understood something I can't explain. I went home that night and told my dad, who served in Desert Storm. He didn't say anything, just nodded. Then he handed me his old copy of a book about Vietnam, told me to read it cover to cover. I did, twice. I just wanted you to know. I'm sorry. And I'm trying to be better now. Thanks for not yelling. Thanks for just sitting. That taught me more than school ever did." There was no name at the bottom, just a scribbled, respectfully, and a small, hand-drawn sketch of the bench by the bank window. Bobby folded the letter and placed it in the wooden box beside his chair. The box was nearly full now, not with medals, but with letters, photos, notes scribbled on receipts or typed on letterhead. They came from all over: former soldiers, students, bank employees, even a retired diplomat from Europe who wrote, "I never knew the man who kept our flank from collapsing, but I recognize his quiet now. I owe him my family's peace." And still, Bobby asked for nothing. Didn't post online, didn't grant interviews. When local reporters came knocking, one from the city paper, another from a veterans podcast, he simply said, "I've already been heard. Let others speak now." He wasn't being humble. He meant it. One afternoon, as he sat beneath the shade of his maple tree, Maya Rodriguez returned. She didn't knock. She didn't even approach right away. She just stood by the sidewalk, eyes thoughtful, hands tucked into the pockets of her jeans. Bobby looked up from his book and nodded. She stepped forward. "I visited Summit Ridge yesterday," she said. "The bank installed a permanent plaque near the front counter. It doesn't have your name on it, just a quote." Bobby raised an eyebrow. Maya continued, "It says, 'Honor doesn't always wear medals. Sometimes it sits quietly, waiting to be seen.' They asked me to write something for it, but I told them it had to come from everyone. So they held a meeting. Dozens of people showed up. Some apologized. Some didn't say anything. They just cried." Bobby nodded slowly. "The world's tired," he said. "It doesn't always know how to cry until someone reminds it." Maya sat beside him on the porch steps. "You know, I used to think service was about fighting, about the front lines, the tactics, the noise, but that day, I realized something. It's also about stillness, the courage to sit down when everyone else is demanding you stand up and prove yourself, and letting the truth do the talking." They sat in silence for a while, watching the wind bend the branches above. Then Maya asked, "Do you think we changed anything?" Bobby thought for a long time before answering. "We didn't change the world," he said, "but we made a few people remember it, and sometimes remembering is the first step toward rebuilding." A week later, Hillview High School held a civics seminar in their modest gymnasium. No press, no live streams, just 80 students, folding chairs, and a makeshift podium. Bobby had agreed, reluctantly. After Maya insisted it wasn't about speeches, it was about presence. He didn't wear his suit, didn't bring his coin, just walked in wearing a brown jacket and jeans, looking more like a grandfather than a veteran. He stood before the students and began, not with stories of war or honor, but with a question: how many of you have ever been mistaken for someone you're not? A few hands went up. How many of you have judged someone too fast? More hands. How many of you wish you could take back a moment, but didn't know how? Almost every hand raised. Bobby nodded. "Well," he said, "I've been all of those things, and I'm still learning. The world will try to label you fast, especially when you're quiet. But being quiet doesn't mean you're invisible. It means you're listening." He didn't speak long, but when he finished, no one moved for several seconds. And when they did, it wasn't to applaud, it was to write. Nearly every student pulled out a notebook. Maya watched from the back, tears in her eyes. In the following months, Bobby's story spread not through headlines, but through people. Word of mouth, letters shared in family dinners, teachers passing the lesson to students. One school painted a mural. A hospital named a waiting room after him. A small airport near an old decommissioned base quietly renamed their terminal lounge the Keen Room, where veterans could sit, reflect, and wait for their next journey without having to explain themselves. And then one autumn evening, as the leaves turned gold and red, Bobby sat by his window and watched the sun descend over the horizon. On the wall across from him, framed in simple oak, hung one final letter. It had arrived without warning, unsigned, typed on a weathered typewriter. It read, "Some men carry battles, others carry silence. You carried both, and taught us that dignity isn't loud. It's patient. Thank you for waiting. We finally caught up." Bobby smiled softly, then stood, crossed the room, and turned off the light. He didn't need it anymore. The light was already in the world, and he had helped it find its way.